The early Roman army was deployed by ancient Rome during its regal era and into the early Republic around 300 BC, when the so-called Polybian or Manipular legion was introduced. Until c. 550 BC, there was probably no national Roman army, but a series of clan-based war bands, which only coalesced into a united force in periods of serious external threat. Around 550 BC, during the period conventionally known as the rule of King Servius Tullius, it appears that a universal levy of eligible adult male citizens was instituted. This development apparently coincided with the introduction of heavy armor for most of the infantry. The early Roman army was based on a compulsory levy from adult male citizens that was held at the start of each campaigning season. In those years that war was declared, there were probably no standing or professional forces. During the regal era, the standard levy was probably of 9,000 men, consisting of 6,000 heavily armed infantry, plus 2,400 light armed infantry and 600 light cavalry. When the kings were replaced by two annually elected praetors in c. 500 BC, the standard levy remained of the same size, but was now divided equally between the praetors, each commanding one legion of 4,500 men. It is likely that the hoplite element was deployed in a Greek-style phalanx formation in large set-piece battles. However, these were relatively rare, with most fighting consisting of small-scale border raids and skirmishing. In these, the Romans would fight in their basic tactical unit, the centuria of 100 men. In addition, clan-based forces remained in existence until at least c. 450 BC, although they would operate under the praetor's authority, at least nominally. In 493 BC, shortly after the establishment of the Roman Republic, Rome concluded a perpetual treaty of military alliance with the combined other Latin city-states. The treaty, probably motivated by the need for the Latins to deploy a united defense against incursions by neighboring hill tribes, provided for each party to provide an equal force for campaigns under unified command. It remained in force until 358 BC. Background: Early Rome. Socio-political developments. According to Roman legend, Rome was founded by Romulus in 753 BC. However, the vast amount of archaeological evidence uncovered since the 1970s suggests that Rome did not assume the characteristics of a united city-state before around 625 BC. The same evidence, however, has also conclusively discredited Alpha Oldi's once fashionable theory that Rome was an insignificant settlement until c. 500 BC. There is now no doubt that Rome was a major city in the period 625–500 BC, when it had an area of c. 285 hectares and an estimated population of 35,000. This made it the second largest in Italy and about half the size of contemporary Athens. Few scholars today dispute that Rome was ruled by kings in its archaic period, although whether any of the 7 names of kings preserved by tradition are historical remains uncertain. It is also likely that there were several more kings than those preserved by tradition, given the long duration of the regal era. The Roman monarchy, although an autocracy, did not resemble a medieval monarchy. It was not hereditary and based on divine right, but elective and subject to the ultimate sovereignty of the people. The king was elected for life by the People's Assembly, although there is strong evidence that the process was in practice controlled by the patricians, a hereditary aristocratic caste. Most kings were non-Romans brought in from abroad, doubtless as a neutral figure who could be seen as above patrician factions. Although a king's blood relations could succeed him, they were still required to submit to election. The position and powers of a Roman king were thus similar to those of Julius Caesar when he was appointed dictator for life in 44 BC and indeed of the succeeding Roman emperors. According to Roman tradition, in 616 BC, an Etruscan named Lucumo, from the town of Tarquinii, was elected king of Rome as Lucius Tarquinius I. He was succeeded by his son-in-law, Servius Tullius, and then by his son, Lucius Tarquinius II. The establishment of this dynasty, of Etruscan origin, has led some dated historians to claim that late regal Rome was occupied by troops from Tarquinii, militarily and culturally Etruscanized. But this theory has been dismissed as a myth by Cornell and other more modern historians, who point to the extensive evidence that Rome remained politically independent, as well as linguistically and culturally a Latin city. In relation to the army, the Cornell faction argue that the introduction of heavy infantry in the late regal era followed Greek, not Etruscan, models. It seems certain that the monarchy was overthrown in c. 500 BC and replaced by some form of collegiate rule. It is likely that the revolution that overthrew the Roman monarchy was engineered by the patrician caste and that its aim was not, as rationalized later by ancient authors, the establishment of a democracy, but of a patrician-dominated oligarchy. The proverbial arrogance and tyranny of the Tarquins, epitomized by the rape of Lucretia incident, is probably a reflection of the patricians' fear of the Tarquins' growing power and their erosion of patrician privilege, most likely by drawing support from the plebeians. To ensure patrician supremacy, the autocratic power of the kings had to be fragmented and permanently curtailed. Thus the replacement of a single ruler by a collegiate administration, which soon evolved into two praetors, with equal powers and limited terms of office. In addition, power was further fragmented by the establishment of further collegiate offices, known to history as Roman magistrates, 3 aedila and 4 quaestors. Patrician supremacy was assured by restricting the eligibility to hold the republican offices to just patricians. The establishment of a hereditary oligarchy obviously excluded wealthy non-patricians from political power, and it is this class that led plebeian opposition to the early republican settlement. The early republic saw a long and often bitter struggle for political equality, known as the conflict of the orders, against the patrician monopoly of power. The plebeian leadership had the advantage that they represented the vast majority of the population and of their own growing wealth. By 338 BC, the privileges of the patricians had become largely ceremonial, but this does not imply a more democratic form of government. The wealthy plebeians who had led the plebeian revolution had no more intention of sharing real power with their poorer and far more numerous fellow plebeians than did the patricians. It was probably at this time that the population was divided, for the purposes of taxation and military service, into 7 classes based on an assessment of their property. The 2 top classes, numerically the smallest, accorded themselves an absolute majority of the votes in the main electoral and legislative assembly. Oligarchy based on birth had been replaced by oligarchy based on wealth. External relations. It appears likely that Rome in the period 550 to 500, conventionally known as the period that it was ruled by the Tarquin dynasty, established its hegemony over the other Latin city-states of Old Latium, which may have been required to pay tribute. The fall of the Roman monarchy was followed by a war with the Latins, who probably took advantage of the political turmoil in Rome to attempt to regain their independence. The Romans apparently prevailed, scoring a notable victory over the Latin forces at Lake Regillus sometime between 499 and 493 BC. But instead of restoring their previous hegemony, the Romans settled for a military alliance on apparently equal terms with the Latins. According to the sources, the Foedus Cassianum was a bilateral treaty between the Romans and the Latin city-states. The impetus to form such an alliance was probably provided by the acute insecurity caused by a phase of migration and invasion of the lowland areas by Italic tribes occupying the mountains surrounding Old Latium. notably the Equi and Volscia. In the period after 500 BC, the new Romano-Latin military alliance proved strong enough to repel the incursions of the Italic mountain tribes, but it was a very tough struggle. Intermittent wars, with mixed fortunes, continued until c. 395 BC. The Sabines disappear from the record in 449 BC, while campaigns against the Equi and Volscia seem to have reached a turning point with the major Roman victory on Mount Gerdes in 431 BC. In the same period, the Romans fought 3 wars against their nearest neighboring Etruscan city-state, Very, finally reducing the city in 396 BC, probably increasing the Ager Romanus by c. 65%. At this juncture, Rome was crushed by an invasion of central Italy by the Gallic Senones tribe. Rooted in the Battle of the River Allia in 386 BC, the Roman army fled to Very, leaving their city at the mercy of the Gauls, who proceeded to ransack it and then demand a huge ransom in gold to leave. The effects of this disaster on Roman power are a matter of controversy between scholars. The ancient authors emphasize the catastrophic nature of the damage, claiming that it took a long time for Rome to recover. Cornell, however, argues that the ancients greatly exaggerated the effects and cites the lack of archaeological evidence for major destruction and the building of the so-called Servian Wall as evidence that Rome recovered swiftly. The wall, whose 11 kilometers circuit enclosed 427 hectares, was a massive project that would have required an estimated 5 million man-hours to complete, implying plentiful financial and labor resources. Against this, Eckstein argues that the history of Rome in the 50 years subsequent to 386 BC appears a virtual replay of the previous century. There were wars against the same enemies except Very in the same geographical area, and indeed against other Latin city-states, such as Praeneste and Tibur, just 30 miles away. In addition, a treaty concluded with Carthage in c. 348 BC seems to describe Rome's sphere of control as much the same area as in a previous treaty signed in the first years of the Republic 150 years earlier. Just Old Latium, and not even all of that. This phase of Roman history ended with the Latin War. The Latin city-states, acting collectively as the Latin League, tried to withdraw from their military alliance with Rome, for fear of the latter's ever-growing political dominance. But the Romans scored a decisive victory and the Latin city-states were either annexed into Roman territory or tied into satellite status.